Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we'll be taking a look at a man who went from a one-time aspiring actor and singer to the leader of a strange and dangerous cult. Marshall Applewhite Jr. was born on March 17, 1931 in Spur, Texas. His father was a Presbyterian minister, something which had a very strong influence on Marshall growing up in many different ways. Logistically speaking, because of his father's profession, the family were forced to move every few years, travelling around towns in Texas, founding and building churches as they went. Marshall first attended Corpus Christi High School, graduating in 1948, and then he went on to study philosophy at Austin College. He was involved in many student organisations, and here we see the other influences of his father's profession on Marshall's life. Marshall was known throughout his college for his strong religious beliefs, although this doesn't seem to have negatively affected his relationship with other students. His former roommate from Austin College described Marshall as a popular extrovert, smart but not pushy, and someone who put their magnetic personality to good use, such as becoming the leader of a choir and joining the Judiciary Council on the board of Presbyterian ministers. Later on we see his father's influence again when Marshall went on to study theology in 1952 in the hopes of becoming a minister, just like his father. Around this time he met and married Ann Pierce. The couple had 2 children together, and both Ann and Marshall remained active in their local church. They were known by family and friends for being sweet and outgoing characters, but this is where things started to take a turn for Marshall. His love for music began to overshadow his desire to become a minister, and he dropped out of school to become the director of music at the First Presbyterian Church in North Carolina. His young family were pretty settled for another few years, but then had to move when Marshall was drafted into the military in 1954. They spent the next 2 years in Salzburg, Austria, and then New Mexico, where he worked as an instructor until he was honorably discharged in 1956. Marshall then enrolled in the University of Colorado to focus on his real passion. He earned a master's degree in music with a focus on musical theatre. He had a nice baritone voice and enjoyed singing and listening to the classics, particularly those with an emphasis on religion. Marshall decided he wanted to try and put that natural affinity and talent and that master's degree to good use. He moved to New York City to pursue a career as a professional singer, but he struggled to make a living, and with a young family to support, he ended up returning to teach at the University of Alabama. Things could have settled here for Marshall. He was still involved with music and his local churches, but he was caught having an affair with one of his male students from the university. Marshall was fired, and when Ann found out, she left him, taking the children with her. Marshall never spoke to his children again. This seemed to be a particularly lonely and difficult time in Marshall's life. We know he struggled to marry his religious beliefs with his sexuality, and when he finally came out to his parents, the man who had one of the biggest influences on Marshall's life so far, his father, rejected him. In 1965, he moved to Houston to take up the position of chair of the music department at the University of St. Thomas. He worked hard and he managed to rebuild his reputation. His students regarded him as an engaging speaker. He was a popular local singer, even becoming the choral director of a church and performing in the Houston Grand Opera, where he would go on to perform 10 roles in various operas and plays. But all of these successes didn't turn things around for Marshall. He resigned from his position in 1970, citing emotional distress and depression. There were more rumours of another relationship with a male student, but these were never confirmed. The president of the university later said that Marshall had become increasingly mentally jumbled and disorganised towards the end of his employment. We know that after breaking away from the university, Marshall made a visit to the hospital. He later told people it was to see a sick and poorly friend. His sister would say it had more to do with him trying to deal with and change his sexuality, and others would say he was hearing voices and visited a psych ward. Whatever his reasons were, this trip to the hospital changed Marshall's life. While he was there, he met a woman who would forever change the course of so many lives, with the first one being the life of Marshall Applewhite. Bonnie Nettles was a nurse and a strong believer in the divine. She practiced astrology, believed in UFOs, and claimed to be in constant contact with a spiritual being named Brother Francis, who helped guide and influence her decisions every day. She told Marshall that the voices in his head were actually spirits from above, and they were telling him that one day he would be a divine teacher. Marshall totally believed her. He said that even though he had just met her, he felt like he had known Bonnie for a long time, and they decided it must be because they had met in a previous life. Bonnie told him that extraterrestrials had told her that they would meet, and Marshall took that to mean that he really must have a divine role here on Earth. The two started to meet regularly, so regularly it led to Bonnie's husband leaving her and also taking her children with him. But that didn't matter. All that mattered to Marshall and Bonnie was that they were on a divine mission. An old friend of Marshall's actually said the relationship Marshall had with Bonnie was something that Marshall had been looking for a long time. He still felt guilty about his homosexual affairs, and what Marshall really wanted was a meaningful, platonic relationship that he could develop without all the sexual entanglements. And that's exactly what he got. Marshall and Bonnie set out to fulfill their divine mission together. They first opened a Christian bookstore, only to close it a short while later. Then the pair decided they would travel around to teach others about their beliefs, and they set off in 1973. They had little to no money. They often had to sleep in their car and would sometimes have to work odd jobs or even sell their blood to make up some much needed funds. They bailed on lodging bills, camped out where they could, and ate whatever they could find. At one point, they lived entirely on bread rolls alone. They spent many hours sitting in the car and reading, sometimes from their Bible, sometimes other religious works, or even science fiction novels. And it was during their many hours together that the pair came to the belief that they were actually the two witnesses from the Book of Revelations. For those of you that don't know, the Book of Revelations tells the story of two witnesses who spread the word and warning of upcoming judgment, but they were eventually martyred. They were then resurrected and taken up to heaven on a cloud, which Marshall and Bonnie would later interpret to mean a spaceship. And this made Marshall and Bonnie's mission so much clearer to them. They now knew what they had to do and how their story would end. But there was a lot more to the mission than what they had initially thought. By June of that year, they had come up with an outline for their story. They had been chosen to fulfill biblical prophecies, and in order to achieve that, they had been given much higher level minds than other people had. They wrote pamphlets about how Jesus had been reborn as a Texan. This was a very thinly veiled attempt at naming Marshall as the next Jesus. And they then began distributing them and discussing their beliefs with others when they visited local churches and other religious meetings. They often called themselves the Two or the UFO Two, and told others about how they would be reborn and transported away to work as part of the crew on a spaceship. The two became increasingly distraught when others didn't seem to share their beliefs, and they then found it hard to gain followers from existing religious communities. They did find their first follower in 1974, a woman named Sharon Morgan. She abandoned her husband and children to join the pair, but only stayed with them for a month before she returned home. Marshall and Bonnie lost more than just a follower when Sharon left. They were arrested and charged with credit card fraud for using Sharon's credit cards, even though Sharon had actually given them permission to. These charges were later dropped, but they did lead to Marshall being arrested for another crime. A routine check found that Marshall was wanted for stealing a rental car from St. Louis 9 months earlier. This was actually the car that he and Bonnie had been living in, and Marshall was sent to prison for 6 months, eventually getting out in early 1975. Marshall told the police that he had been divinely authorized to keep the car. Instead of giving the two space to clear their thoughts and get out from under the other's influence, this time in jail seemed to really solidify Marshall's beliefs in their divine mission. When he was released, Marshall and Bonnie decided it was time for them to make contact with extraterrestrials. They placed advertisements for meetings in local newspapers, and they started to gain followers. They nicknamed their followers the Crew, already putting an emphasis on the end goal and destination of their new religion. During these meetings, Marshall and Bonnie claimed to be representatives from another planet and told the others that they were looking for people to take part in a grand experiment. They said that those who agreed and actually took part in the experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level and become the next level. This was as confusing to most people then as I'm sure it is to you right now, and we will go into it in more detail later on. But these first meetings created a platform for Marshall and Bonnie, and they soon managed to make a big break in their growing experiment. In 1975, they spoke during another meeting of a metaphysical group led by Clarence Klung. Klung was a metaphysical teacher who held a lot of weight within her own communities. A friend of Klung, Joan Culpepper, remembered the night that she'd heard Marshall and Bonnie speak. She said that she went to Klung's expansive Studio City home to help gather a group of around 80 people for a nighttime meeting. Culpepper said she found Marshall quite attractive. He had sharp blue eyes, and both he and Bonnie were wearing sweatpants and desert boots. They stood in front of the meeting and introduced themselves as Guinea and Pig to put emphasis on their role in their cosmic experiment. They were cold and stern. They told the meeting that they would be assassinated and die, and anyone who followed them would travel with them on a spaceship to a higher level, otherwise known as heaven. Culpepper almost couldn't believe it when almost 30 of the people there that night joined the two right away. They were already making plans to trek to the Oregon coast and rendezvous with the pair. She said she was filled with mixed emotions. Many of Marshall and Bonnie's new followers were her friends and had only been there that night because Culpepper had invited them. Culpepper was in her 40s. She had one daughter who was already an adult, and she eventually decided to follow the others in order to keep an eye on the situation and to try to help her friends. She became a strong critic of the two and their teachings, and after 6 weeks of questioning and voicing her doubts, she and another member were left behind when the group moved on. She opened a halfway house for other former members and tried to speak up against the movement whenever she could. This earned her the nickname Judas amongst Marshall and Bonnie and their followers. She lost contact with them later that year when, after preaching at a motel in Waldport, Oregon, Marshall and Bonnie and their followers sold all of their worldly possessions and went underground. A news report made on the disappearances was actually one of the first national reports made on the group, but it definitely wouldn't be the last. The report said, "A score of persons have disappeared. It's a mystery whether they've been taken on a so-called trip to eternity or if they've simply been taken." Marshall and Bonnie began changing the makeup of the group. They renamed themselves Doe and T, and they led the now almost 100-strong crew on their mission across the country. They slept in tents and sleeping bags, and they started begging on the streets, blending in with the homeless and remaining under the police and media radars. Now that they were almost invisible, the group were able to focus on Doe and T's teachings of achieving a higher evolutionary level, above the rest of humanity. They kept recruiting to their crew as they travelled, telling anyone who would listen about their gospel of higher level metamorphosis, the deceit of false god spirits, the healing properties of meditation in sunlight, and the divinity of the UFO too. By 1976, they were done recruiting. They decided to focus on a monastic lifestyle and had to shed every attachment they had to the planet. This time, this didn't just mean all their worldly possessions. The followers of Doe and T had to give up on all their human-like characteristics. This included not only their family and friends, but also their gender, sexuality, and individuality. None of those things could travel with them to the evolutionary level above human, which was a physical, corporeal place in another universe where residents lived in pure bliss and nourished themselves on pure sunlight. There was no sexual intercourse or eating or dying, and there Doe and T and their followers would meet the highly developed extraterrestrial being that the Bible called God. They also believed that humans were led astray by evil space aliens called the Luciferians, who had infiltrated and corrupted all other existing religions on the planet. These aliens falsely represented themselves to Earthlings as God, and their main purpose on Earth was to keep humans from developing. They had access to advanced technologies like spacecrafts and space time travel, and even though they had humanoid bodies, they could use telepathy and had much longer lifespans than humans. They used holograms to fake miracles. They focused on gender and sexuality and had stopped trying to gain access to the kingdom of God thousands of years ago. It's also here that the group transforms from a loosely organised social group to a centralised religious movement, officially led by Marshall and Bonnie. The two changed their story, now no longer believing that they were representatives from another alien planet. At the time, the concept of walk-ins was quickly becoming popular, and this was reflected in Marshall and Bonnie's teachings. A walk-in, for those of you who don't know, is a similar concept to spirit possession. But instead of their bodies being possessed by spirits, their souls had actually already left their bodies and been replaced by those of extraterrestrials. This also helped Marshall and Bonnie get a fresh start within the group. Their followers no longer believed them to be the same people who had founded the movement, and this helped Marshall and Bonnie re-establish the religion around themselves. They told their followers that their human personal histories, as in the histories of the souls who had formerly occupied their bodies, had been erased, and now they were on a new path. Over time, Marshall began to take it a step further, claiming that the extraterrestrial entity that inhabited his body was now the same one who had once occupied Jesus Christ's almost 2,000 years ago. He and 8 other men within the group underwent voluntary castration to help them to try to achieve a more next-level thought process and erase their sexual urges and tendencies. The first castration was actually performed by another member of the following who was a former nurse, but her attempt to castrate her fellow believer was unsuccessful and almost resulted in his death. One member actually decided to leave the group after witnessing the botched operation, and after that, Marshall and the others who still wanted to be castrated had the procedures done in a hospital. Another concept that Marshall and Bonnie incorporated into their belief system was the hypothesis of ancient astronauts. They believed that ancient astronauts, or extraterrestrials, had visited Earth at various points in the past, planting the seeds of current humanity in our ancient ancestors millions of years ago. They also believed that those ancient astronauts had now returned to reap the harvest of their work in the form of spiritually involved individuals. These individuals would then join the ranks of flying saucer crews. Only a few very select members of humanity would be chosen to work with these extraterrestrials and escape human suffering. The rest of humanity would be left to wallow in the spiritually poisoned atmosphere of the corrupt world. Only the followers of Marshall and Bonnie's teachings would ever be able to follow them onto these ships, because believers in them would make the sacrifices needed to be able to be biologically and chemically transformed into the next evolutionary level above human and into a spaceship crew member. The group continued to roam, making their money begging and doing odd jobs, and handing everything they had over to their leaders. But almost a decade later, something happened that would shake the foundation of the religion to its very core. In 1985, after a lengthy battle, Bonnie Nettles died of cancer. This was a direct challenge and contradiction to the religion's view on ascension. They had covered the idea of being assassinated or martyred, but the main philosophy behind the teaching was that Doe and T would be taken up to the spaceship alive because they had already achieved a higher level when they had first been sent as representatives from another planet. Marshall had to rethink the mission, and this time he had to do it alone. Eventually, he came back with an idea that settled any disputes amongst his followers. He said that the body was only a container or a vehicle for the soul, and it was actually the soul that was transferred to their next level bodies after death. His followers believed him. A few years later, in 1990, the group settled and founded their own business named Higher Source. They even created their own website and began recruiting followers and support through the internet, and made money creating websites for other companies. It is during this time that rumours began to spread throughout the group of the upcoming comet hale-bopp, and how it would lead them to the secret of achieving their ultimate salvation and their ascension into the kingdom of heaven. In 1995, the group purchased a plot of land near Manzano, New Mexico, and began developing a compound made out of rubber tyres and concrete, but abandoned the project suddenly in April of that year. It was also around this time that they began calling themselves Heaven's Gate, dropping the rather wordy previous names of the Human Individual Metamorphosis and Total Overcomers Anonymous. In 1996, they put their website money to good use and began to rent out a mansion in Paseo, Victoria, which they nicknamed the Monastery. They were able to pay the $7,000 rent each month in cash, and during the first month they began renting the large home. The group also took out an insurance policy on over 50 members of the cult. This policy would cover abduction, impregnation and or death by aliens, and would actually pay out over $1 million per person if the claim could be proven. A former member spoke of life in the monastery. She said her guess was 3/4 of the people living there never stepped foot out of the door. Another said that he'd tried to get a job and people wouldn't hire him because they thought he must be crazy if he believed in Marshall's teachings. He actually argued against that and said he'd only left the cult because he had to choose between them and making a living, and to this day he misses living in the monastery. Whether the members were actually crazy or not, their website made an intriguing and disturbing update in March 1997. The update read, "Hale-bopp brings closure to Heaven's Gate. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to conclusion. A graduation from the human evolutionary level. We are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew." Just before this update, and unknown to most readers and the public at the time, Marshall Applewhite began taping himself in a home video named Doe's Final Exit.
This is March 19, 1997. And I'm Doe. Some called our partnership T and Doe.
He talked about a mass suicide and how it was the only way to evacuate this earth. This was a break from the religion's previous beliefs on suicide. They had previously believed that to take your own life was to turn against the next level, but the following belief of their bodies only being vehicles helped them to accept the next part of their mission. They believed that there was a spaceship trailing behind the hale-bopp comet, and Marshall convinced his following that their souls would be able to board that spaceship if they performed a ritual sacrifice whilst the comet was passing. Each member filmed their own goodbye tapes before their final journey and prepared their souls to ascend to another level of existence above human. The suicides were performed in groups. The first group of members of Heaven's Gate, ready to ascend, mixed a toxic and poisonous batch of chemicals into apple sauce and puddings, and they washed the desserts down with a healthy serving of vodka. Then they tied plastic bags around their heads to induce asphyxiation and slipped away in their sleep. The remaining members collected their bodies, removed the plastic bags from their heads, and laid their deceased crew members neatly down on their beds. They placed a square purple cloth over their faces and torsos for privacy, and then it was the next group's turn. Another batch of members ate their desserts, drank their vodka, and tied their plastic bags around their heads. Eventually, only 3 people remained, Marshall and 2 others. They worked together to prepare the bodies of their former followers, doing the same things of removing their bags and lying them in bed. And then it was Marshall's turn. He was found in his bed. The remaining 2 members apparently dying together, as they were found with no cloths over their faces and their bags still tied around their heads. All 39 bodies weren't found until days later, when a former member, Rio de Angelo, received a package on March the 25th with Doe's final exit and a tape with the other members saying their goodbyes inside. There was also a letter stating that the members of Heaven's Gate had exited their vehicles just as they had entered them. D'Angelo made his way to the house, wanting to verify the contents of the letter and tapes, and he found the back door unlocked. He found the former members lying in their beds and called the San Diego County Sheriff's Department to tell them what he had discovered. He didn't give them his name, only leaving an anonymous tip suggesting that the police do a welfare check on the residents of the mansion. Only one deputy was sent to check on the home. He entered through the side door and immediately found 10 dead bodies and was overcome by a terrible odour. It was a hot Californian spring, and the heat increased the speed of decomposition, leaving an unimaginable stench throughout the entire home. He quickly left, calling for more deputies to come down and help him search for survivors. They found none. 21 women and 18 men were dead. All 39 members were found wearing the same black shirt and sweatpants, a brand new pair of black and white Nike Decade shoes, and a patch that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. The shirts and sweatpants were in keeping with the asexual and non-gendered message. The armbands a nod to the series Star Trek. The Nikes were apparently because Marshall had been able to get a good deal on them, but he was known especially by the other members of Heaven's Gate for his love of the brand. Many members adopting Nike's slogan into their everyday vocabulary, but changing it to be just do it. The Doe being pronounced like Marshall's nickname, Doe, just do it. They were also all found with a $5 bill and 3 quarters in their pockets. This was a nod to the group's tradition of sending someone off when they were leaving the cult for a job. The former member would be given the $5 to cover the cost of vagrancy fines, and the 3 quarters were for calling home from a payphone. It was also the group's way of telling the remaining members and the rest of the world that they would not be coming back to Earth. The discovery of the bodies created a media frenzy and became the target for more unfortunate copycat suicides. A 58-year-old man living in California was discovered on March the 31st by a friend. He was dead in his home, his body left in a similar fashion to the Heaven's Gate bodies, and beside him was a note dated from March the 27th. He wrote that he was going on the spaceship with hale-bopp to be with those who had gone before him. He had no known connection to Heaven's Gate. 3 former members took their own lives in the following months. 2 of them attempted this in a hotel room in May 1997. Only one of them died, with the survivor taking his own life a year later. Another member died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in May of that year. When the news first broke about the mass suicides, the co-discoverer of the comet, Alan Hale, felt compelled to speak about it. He gave a speech the following day in a press conference after researching the details of the suicides. He discussed the important scientific significance of discovering comets and touched on popular and historical lore associated with them. He then went on to condemn the combination of scientific illiteracy and the willful delusions that had led to the heavensgate mass suicide. He told a colleague that he was not really surprised that there had been suicides connected with the comet and that comets were lovely objects, but they had no apocalyptic significance. He went on to urge people to use their minds and their reason over anything else. There is also a lot of research and emphasis put on the surge of popular movements and alternative religious experiences that were common in the era. Sociologists contribute the momentum that Marshall and Bonney's movement gained to its appeal to people of all religious backgrounds. They were very accepting of people's former religious affiliations and preferred to put an emphasis on a shared and generalized faith, appealing to people who would define themselves as long-time truth seekers who wanted to find themselves through spiritual means. But not all of Heaven's Gate members were the stereotypical hippies of the 70s and 80s. One early crew member was a man named John Craig, a ranch owner and respected Republican who had come very close to winning the 1970 Colorado House of Representatives race. What can be said about the former members of the cult, however, particularly from the pre-internet days, was a common need for communal belonging and an alternative path to that higher existence that didn't involve the constraints and regulations that came with already established religions. Perhaps we can see that in the cult's founding members, Marshall and Bonney seem to have been fundamentally lonely people. They connected over their common interests of religion and science fiction and went on to gather others around them. We also can see Marshall's inability to marry his sexuality with his firm belief in Christianity. We could argue that he went on to try to control the influences both of these things had on his life by adding an emphasis on asexuality and the removal of gender in his new religion, whilst marrying the parts of Christianity that spoke to him with the concept of extraterrestrial beings. It's been almost 25 years since the mass suicides, but Heaven's Gate lives on, both in our popular culture but also on their website. Higher Source is still active. Former members of the cult and members of the Teller Foundation, that stands for the evolutionary level above human, are suspected to be the ones behind the updates and maintenance of the website. But little can be said about what physically remains of Marshall Applewhite here on Earth. All 39 bodies were ultimately cremated, Marshall's amongst them, and now ashes are all that remain of the self-proclaimed prophet and the man who led his followers into one of the most elaborate and confusing mass suicides the modern world has ever seen. Thank you for listening to today's video about Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate. Please like, comment and subscribe if you are new to the channel. For those of you that like longer videos, I've made a playlist called Over 25 Minutes Long. It will be in the top right hand corner at the end screen at the end of the video. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. One of the housemates, Trevor Nichols, was the brother of the lady that played Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek. Goodbye.